If the huge price changes that occur in individual stocks are made solely because of changed appraisals by the financial community, with these appraisals sometimes completely at variance with what is going on in the real world of a company's affairs, what significance have the other three dimensions? Why bother with the expertise of business management, scientific technology, or accounting at all? Why not just depend on psychologists? The answer involves timing. Because of a financial community appraisal that is at variance with the facts, a stock may sell for a considerable period for much more or much less than it is intrinsically worth. Furthermore, many segments of the financial community have the habit of playing follow the leader, particularly when that leader is one of the larger New York City banks. This sometimes means that when an unrealistic appraisal of a stock is already causing it to sell well above what a proper recognition of the facts would justify, the stock may stay at this too high level for a long period of time. Actually, from this already too high a price it may go even higher. These wide variations between the financial community's appraisal of a stock and the true set of conditions affecting it may last for several years. Always, however, sometimes within months, sometimes only after a much longer period of time, the bubble bursts. When a stock has been selling too high because of unrealistic expectations, sooner or later a growing number of stockholders grow tired of waiting. Their selling soon more than exhausts the buying power of the small number of additional buyers who still have faith in the old appraisal. The stock then comes tumbling down. Sometimes the new appraisal that follows is quite realistic. Frequently, however, as this re-examination evolves under the emotional pressure of falling prices, the negative is overemphasized, resulting in a new financial community appraisal that is significantly less favorable than the facts warrant and that may then prevail for some time. However, when this happens, much the same thing occurs as when the appraisal is too favorable. The only difference is that the process is reversed. It may take months or years for a more favorable image to supplant the existing one. Nevertheless, as pleasing earnings mount upward, sooner or later this happens. Fortunate holders, those who don't sell out as such a stock starts to rise, then benefit from the phenomenon that provides the greatest reward in relation to the risk involved the stock market can produce. This is the dramatic improvement in price that results from the combined effect of both the steady improvement in per-share earnings and a sharp, simultaneous increase in the price-earnings ratio. As the financial community quite correctly discovers that the fundamentals of the company, now its new image, have much more investment work than had been recognized when the old image was in effect, the resulting increase in the price-earnings ratio is frequently an even more important factor in the increased price of the stock than the actual increase in per-share earnings that accompanies it. This is precisely what happened in our company example. We are now in a position to begin to get a true perspective on the degree of conservatism, that is, of basic risk in any investment. On the lowest end of the risk scale and most suitable for wise investment is a company that measures quite high in regard to the first three dimensions but currently is appraised by the financial community as less worthy, and therefore has a lower price-earnings ratio than these fundamental facts warrant. Next least risky and usually quite suitable for intelligent investment is the company rating quite high in regard to the first three dimensions and having an image and therefore a price-earnings ratio reasonably in line with these fundamentals. This is because such a company will continue to grow if it truly has these attributes. Next least risky and, in my opinion, usually suitable for retention by conservative investors who own them but not for fresh purchase with new funds are companies that are equally strong in regard to the first three dimensions but, Because these qualities have become almost legendary in the financial community, have an appraisal or price-earnings ratio higher than is warranted by even the strong fundamentals. In my opinion, there are important reasons such stocks should usually be retained, even though their prices seem too high. If the fundamentals are genuinely strong, these companies will in time increase earnings not only enough to justify present prices but to justify considerably higher prices. Meanwhile, the number of truly attractive companies in regard to the first three dimensions is fairly small. Undervalued ones are not easy to find. The risk of making a mistake and switching into one that seems to meet all of the first three dimensions but actually does not is probably considerably greater for the average investor than the temporary risk of staying with a thoroughly sound but currently overvalued situation until genuine value catches up with current prices. Investors who agree with me on this particular point must be prepared for occasional sharp contractions in the market value of these temporarily overvalued stocks. On the other hand, it is my observation that those who sell such stocks to wait for a more suitable time to buy back these same shares seldom attain their objective. They usually wait for a decline to be bigger than it actually turns out to be. The result is that some years later, when this fundamentally strong stock has reached peaks of value considerably higher than the point at which they sold, they have missed all of this later move and may have gone into a situation of considerably inferior intrinsic quality. Continuing up our scale of ascending risks, we come next to the stocks that are average or relatively low in quality in regard to the first three dimensions but have an appraisal in the financial community either lower than, or about in line with, these not very attractive fundamentals. Those with a poorer appraisal than basic conditions warrant may be good speculations but are not suitable for the prudent investor. In the fast-moving world of today, there is just too much danger of adverse developments severely affecting such shares. Finally, we come to what is by far the most dangerous group of all, companies with a present financial community appraisal or image far above what is currently justified by the immediate situation. Purchase of such shares can cause the sickening losses that tend to drive investors away from stock ownership in droves and threaten to shake the investment industry to its foundations. If anyone wants to make a case-by-case study of the contrast between the financial community appraisals that prevailed at one time about some quite colorful companies and the fundamental conditions that subsequently came to light, he will find plenty of material in a business library or the files of the larger Wall Street houses. It is alarming to read some of the reasons given in brokerage reports recommending purchase of these shares and then to compare the outlook described in such documents with what actually was to happen. A fragmentary list of such companies might include Memorex High 1737/8, Ampex High 497/8, Lovitz Furniture High 60.5, Mohawk Data Sciences High 111, Litton Industries High 101.75, Calvar High 176.5. The list could go on and on and on. However, more examples would serve only to make the same point over and over. Since it should already be quite apparent how important is the habit of evaluating any difference that may exist between a contemporary financial community appraisal of a company and the fundamental aspects of that company, it should be more productive for us to spend our time examining further the characteristics of these financial community appraisals. First, however, to avoid risk of misunderstanding, it seems advisable to avoid semantic confusion by defining two of the words in our original statement of the rule governing all major changes in the price of common stocks. Every significant price move of any individual common stock in relation to stocks as a whole occurs because of a changed appraisal of that stock by the financial community. The phrase significant price changes is used rather than merely price changes. This is to exclude the kind of minor price variation that occurs if, say, an estate has 20,000 shares of a stock that a clumsy broker rapidly dumps on the market, with the result that the stock drops a point or two and then usually recovers as the liquidation ends. Similarly, at times an institution will determine that on going into a new situation it must buy a minimum number of shares. The result is frequently a small one-time bulge that subsides on completion of this sort of buying. Such moves, in the absence of a genuinely changed appraisal of the company by the financial community as a whole, have no important or long-term effect on the price of the shares. Usually such small price changes disappear once the special buying or selling is over. The term financial community has been used to include all those able and enough interested to be potentially ready to buy or sell a particular stock at some price, keeping in mind that, with regard to impact on price, the importance of each of these potential buyers and sellers is weighted by the amount of buying or selling power each is in a position to exercise. 5. More about the fourth dimension. Up to this point, our discussion of the financial community's appraisal of a stock may have given the impression that this appraisal is nothing more than an evaluation of that particular equity, considered by itself. This is oversimplification. Actually, it always results from the blending of three separate appraisals: the current financial community appraisal of the attractiveness of common stocks as a whole, of the industry of which the particular company is a part, and, finally, of the company itself. Let us first examine the matter of industry appraisals. Everyone knows that, over long periods of time, there can be a sizable decline in the price-earnings ratio the financial community will pay to participate in an industry as it passes from an early stage when huge markets appear ahead to a much later period where it, in turn, may be threatened by new technologies. Thus, in the early years of the electronics industry, companies making electronic tubes, in that period the fundamental building block of all electronics, sold at very high price-earnings ratios. Then price-earnings ratios shrank drastically as the development of semiconductors steadily narrowed the tube market. Makers of magnetic memory devices have more recently suffered the same fate for the same reason. All this is obvious and thoroughly understood. What is not so obvious or comparably understood is how the image of an industry can rise or fall in financial community status, not because of such overpowering influences as these, but because at a given time the financial community is stressing one particular set of industry background influences rather than another. Yet both sets of background conditions may have been quite valid for some time, and both may give every indication of continuing to be for the reasonable future. The chemical industry may be cited as an example. From the depths of the Great Depression until the middle 1950s, the shares of the largest U.S. chemical companies sold at quite high price-earnings ratios compared to most other stocks. The financial community's idea of these companies might have been depicted in a cartoon as an endless conveyor belt. At one end were scientists making breathtaking new compounds in test tubes. After passing through mysterious and hard-to-imitate factories, these materials came out at the other end as fabulous new products such as nylon, DDT, synthetic rubber, quick-drying paint, and endless other new materials that seemed sure to be an ever-increasing source of wealth for their fortunate producers. Then, as the 1960s arrived, the image changed. The chemical industry, to the investment community, came to resemble steel or cement or paper in that it was selling bulk commodities on a basis of technical specifications, so that Jones's chemicals were more or less identical with Smith's. Capital-intensive industries usually are under major pressure to operate at high rates of capacity in order to amortize their large fixed investments. The result is frequently intense price competition and narrowing profit margins. This changed image caused the shares of the major chemical companies to sell at significantly lower price-earnings ratios in relation to stocks as a whole in the, say, 10-year period that ended in 1972 than they had in the past. While still considerably higher than in many industries, chemical price-earnings ratios started more closely to resemble those of industries like steel, paper, and cement. Now the remarkable thing about all this is that with one important exception there was little or nothing different in the fundamental background of this industry in the 1960s than there was in the prior 30 years. It is true that in the latter half of the 1960s there was a serious glut of capacity in certain areas such as the manufacture of most synthetic textile products. This was a major temporary depressant of the earnings of certain of the leading chemical companies, particularly DuPont. But the basic characteristics of the industry had in no way changed sufficiently to account for this rather drastic change in the industry's status in the financial community. Chemical manufacture always had been capital-intensive. Most products had always been sold on a technical specification basis so that Jones could seldom raise his price above Smith's. On the other hand, as a host of new and greatly improved pesticides, packaging materials, textiles, drugs, and countless other products have shown, the 1960s and the 1970s have afforded this industry an ever-expanding market. Opportunities seem almost limitless for human brains to rearrange molecules so as to create products not found in nature that will have special properties to cater to the needs of man better or more cheaply than the previously used natural materials. Finally, in both the previous period of higher and the more recent period of lower esteem for chemical stocks, still another factor had remained almost constant. The older and larger volume chemical products, representing in a sense the first step processing of tailored materials from such basic sources of molecules as salt or hydrocarbons, were inevitably products sold mainly by specification and on a price-competitive basis. Nevertheless, for the alert company there always was and continued to be the opportunity to process these first-step products into much more complicated and higher-priced ones. These, at least for a while, could be sold on a much more proprietary and therefore less competitive basis. As these products in turn become price competitive, the alert companies have consistently found still newer ones to add to the higher profit margin end of their lines. In other words, all the favorable factors, so much in the financial community's mind when chemical stocks were darlings of the market, continued to be there after they had lost considerable status. But the unfavorable factors so much in the forefront in the 1960s were also there in the earlier period when they were largely ignored. What had shifted was the emphasis, not the facts. But the facts, too, can change. Starting about the middle of 1973, chemical stocks began regaining favor in the financial community. This was because a new view of the industry was starting to prevail. In the scarcity-plagued economy the major industrial nations have been experiencing for the first time, except during major wars, in modern times, manufacturing capacity can be increased only gradually. Hence, it may be years before cutthroat price competition will occur again. This image opens up a whole new ballgame for the investor in chemical stocks. The problem for investors now becomes one of determining whether the background facts warrant the new image and, if they do, whether chemical stocks, in relation to the market as a whole, have risen more than or not as much as may be warranted by the new situation. Recent financial history offers countless other examples of much larger changes in price-earnings ratios that occurred because the financial community's appraisal of the industry's background changed radically while the industry itself remained almost exactly the same. In 1969, the computer-to-peripheral stocks were great market favorites. These were the companies making all the special equipment that could be added to the central computing unit or mainframe of a computer to increase the user's benefits from that central unit. High-speed printers, extra memory units, and keyboard devices to eliminate the need for key punch operators and getting data into a computer were some of the major products in this group. The prevailing image then was that these companies had an almost limitless future. While the central computer itself was largely developed and its market would be dominated by a few strong, established companies, the small independent would be able to undercut the big companies in these peripheral areas. Today there is a new awareness of the financial strain on small companies with products that are usually leased rather than sold and of the determination of the major computer mainframe manufacturers to fight for the market of the products hung on their equipment. Have the fundamentals changed, or is it the appraisal of the fundamentals that has changed? An extreme case of a changed appraisal is the way in which the financial community looked on the fundamentals of the franchising business and franchise stocks in 1969 in contrast to 1972. Here again, as with computer-to-peripheral stocks, all the problems of the industry were inherently there when these stocks were being bought at such high price-earnings ratios but were being overlooked when the prevailing image was one of uninterrupted growth for the company momentarily doing well. In this whole matter of industry image, the investor's problem is always the same. Is the current prevailing appraisal one more favorable, less favorable, or about the same as that warranted by the basic economic facts? At times this can present an acute problem to even the most sophisticated investors. One example occurred in December 1958 when Smith, Barney & Company, traditionally conservative investment bankers, took a pioneering step that seems purely routine today but appeared quite the contrary at that time. They made a public offering of the equity shares of the A.C. Nielsen Co. This company had no factories, no tangible product, and therefore no inventories. Instead, it was in the service business, receiving fees for supplying market research information to its customers. It was true that in 1958 banks and insurance companies had long been well regarded in the marketplace as industries worthy of conservative investment. However, such industries were hardly comparable. Since the book value of a bank or insurance company is in cash, liquid investments or accounts receivable, the investor buying a bank or insurance stock seemed to have a hardcore value to fall back on that did not exist for this new kind of service company being introduced to the financial public. However, investigation of the A.C. Nielsen situation revealed unusually good fundamentals. There was an honest and capable management, a uniquely strong competitive position and good prospects for many years of further growth. Nevertheless, until experience showed how the financial community would react to its first exposure to this kind of an industry, there did appear to be some reason for hesitation in buying. Would it take years for a realistic appraisal of the investment worth of such a company to displace the fear that might be engendered by the lack of some of the familiar yardsticks of value? It may seem ridiculous today, when for many years a company like A.C. Nielsen has enjoyed a price-earnings ratio signifying a very high investment appraisal. But some of us who decided to take a chance on the fundamentals being recognized and bought these shares at that time experienced a sensation almost like stepping off a cliff and seeing if the air would support us. So new was the concept of a service company in contrast to concepts to which we were accustomed. Actually, within a few years the pendulum swung quite the other way. As A.C. Nielsen's profits grew and grew, a new concept arose in Wall Street. A large number of companies, many quite different in economic fundamentals but all dealing in services rather than products, were lumped together in a financial community image as parts of the highly attractive service industry. Some began selling at higher price-earnings ratios than they might have deserved. As always, in time, fundamentals dominated, and this false image formed by lumping quite different companies into one group faded away. This point cannot be overstressed. The conservative investor must be aware of the nature of the current financial community appraisal of any industry in which he is interested. He should constantly be probing to see whether that appraisal is significantly more or less favorable than the fundamentals warrant. Only by judging properly on this point can he be reasonably sure about one of the three variables that will govern the long-term trend of market price of stocks of that industry. 6. Still more about the fourth dimension. The financial community's appraisal of a company's own characteristics is an even more important factor in the price-earnings ratio than is the appraisal of the industry in which the company is engaged. The most desirable investment traits of individual companies have been defined in our discussion of the first three dimensions of a conservative investment. In general, the more closely the financial community's appraisal of a particular stock approaches these characteristics, the higher will be its price-earnings ratio. To the degree by which it falls below these standards, the price-earnings ratio will tend to decline. The investor can best determine which stocks are importantly undervalued or overvalued by a shrewd determination of the degree to which the real facts concerning any particular company present an investment situation significantly better or significantly worse than that painted by the current financial image of that company. In making a determination as to the relative attractiveness of two or more stocks, investors often confuse themselves by attempting too simple a mathematical approach to such a problem. Let us suppose, for example, they compare two companies, the profits of each of which, after careful study, appear to afford prospects of growing at a rate of 10% a year. If one is selling at 10 times earnings and the other at 20 times, the stock selling at 10 times earnings appears cheaper. It may be. It also may not be. There can be a number of reasons for this. The seemingly cheaper company may have such a leveraged capitalization, interest charges and preferred dividends that must be earned before anything accrues to the common stockholder, that the danger of interruption of the expected growth rate may be much greater in the lower price-earnings ratio stock. Similarly, for purely business reasons, while the growth rate would seem a most probable estimate for both stocks, nevertheless the chance of the unexpected upsetting these estimates may be considerably more for the one stock than for the other. Another far more important and far less understood way to reach wrong conclusions is to rely too much on simple comparisons of the price-earnings ratios of stocks that seem to be offering comparable opportunities for growth. To illustrate this, let us assume that there are two stocks with an equally strong prospect of doubling earnings over the next 4 years and that both are selling at 20 times earnings, while in the same market companies which are sound otherwise but have no growth prospects are selling at 10 times earnings. Let us suppose that 4 years later the price-earnings ratios of stocks as a whole are unchanged so that generally sound stocks, but ones with no growth prospects, are still selling at 10 times earnings. Let us also suppose that at this same time, 4 years later, one of our two stocks has much the same growth prospects for the time ahead as it had 4 years before, so that the financial community's appraisal is that this stock should again double its earnings over the next 4 years. This means it would still be selling at 20 times the doubled earnings of the past 4 years, or, in other words, that it had also doubled in price in that period. In contrast, at this same time, 4 years after our example had started, the second stocks had also doubled its earnings, just as had been expected. But at this point the financial community's appraisal is for flat earnings in an otherwise sound company over the next 4 years. This would mean that owners of this second stock were in for a market disappointment even though the 4-year doubling of earnings had come through exactly as forecast. With an image of no growth in earnings for the next 4 years, they would now be seeing a price-earnings ratio of only 10 in this second stock. Therefore, while the earnings had doubled, the price of the stocks had remained the same. All this can be summarized in a basic investment rule: the further into the future profits will continue to grow, the higher the price-earnings ratio an investor can afford to pay. This rule, however, should be applied with great caution. It should never be forgotten that the actual variations in price-earnings ratio will result not from what will actually happen but from what the financial community currently believes will happen. In a period of general market optimism, a stock may sell at an extremely high price-earnings ratio because the financial community quite correctly envisages many years of great growth ahead. But many years will have to elapse before this growth is fully realized. The great growth that had been correctly discounted in the price-earnings ratio is likely to become undiscounted for a while, particularly if the company experiences a type of temporary setback that is not uncommon for even the best of companies. In times of general market pessimism, this kind of undiscounting of some of the very finest investments can reach rather extreme levels. When it does, it affords the patient investor with the ability to distinguish between current market image and true facts, some of the most attractive opportunities common stocks can offer for handsome long-term profits at relatively small risk. A rather colorful example of how sophisticated investors attempt to anticipate a changed investment community appraisal of a company occurred on March 13, 1974. The previous day the New York Stock Exchange closing price of Motorola was 485/8. On March 13 the closing quotation was 60, a gain of almost 25%. What had happened was that after the close of the exchange on the 12th, an announcement was made that Motorola was getting out of the television business and was selling its U.S. television plants and inventory to Matsushita, a large Japanese manufacturer, for approximate book value. Now it had been known generally that Motorola's television business was operating at a small loss and to that extent was draining the profits of the rest of the company's business. This of itself would warrant the news to cause some increase in the price of the shares, although hardly the degree of rise that actually occurred. Considerably more complex reasoning was the main motivation behind the buying. For some time a considerable body of investors had believed that Motorola's profitable divisions, particularly its communications division, made this company one of the very few American electronics companies qualified as being of truly high-grade investment status. For example, Spencer Trask and Company had issued a report by security analyst Otis Bradley that discussed the investment merits of Motorola's communications division in considerable detail. This report took the unusual approach of calculating the current and estimated future price-earnings ratio, not for Motorola's earnings as a whole but merely for this one division alone. The report compared the estimated sales volume and price-earnings ratio of just this one division with those of Hewlett-Packard and PerkinElmer, generally considered to be among the very finest of electronics companies from an investment standpoint. From the report the inference could easily be drawn, this was not specifically stated, that the investment quality of Motorola's communications division was such that it was worth, by itself, the then current price of Motorola shares so that, in effect, a buyer of the stock was getting all the other divisions for nothing. With this opinion about Motorola existing in some highly sophisticated places, what may be judged to have induced such eager buying on the Matsushita news? These Motorola enthusiasts had long known that many elements of the financial community were inclined to look with disfavor on the stock because of its television manufacturing image. Most of the financial community, upon hearing Motorola, first thought of television and secondly of semiconductors. At the time of the Matsushita announcement, Standard & Poor's stock guide, in the small amount of space available for listing the principal business of each company, described Motorola as radio and TV semiconductors. All of which, though not inaccurate, was misleading in that it suggested a different sort of company from what, in fact, Motorola really was, and completely overlooked the very important communications division, which at the time comprised almost half of the company. Some of those buying Motorola on the Matsushita news undoubtedly rushed in merely because the news was good and therefore could be expected to send the stock up. But there is reason to ascribe considerable buying to the belief that the financial community's appraisal of the company had been considerably less favorable than the facts warranted. The historical record was such that in the television business Motorola was regarded more as an also-ran than as an industry leader such as Zenith. With the television operations no longer blurring investors' vision of what else was there, a new image with a very much higher price-earnings ratio would arise. Were those who rushed in to pay these higher prices for Motorola wise in so doing? Not entirely. In subsequent weeks the shares lost the immediate gain so that a degree of patience would have paid. In downward markets, a change for the worse in the financial community's image of a company gets accepted far more quickly than a change for the better. Just the opposite is true in rising markets. Unfortunately for those who rushed in to buy Motorola on this news, the immediately ensuing weeks saw a sharp upturn in short-term interest rates which produced a downward trend in the general market and accentuated the widespread bear market psychology then prevailing. Perhaps another influence was also at work against those who snapped up Motorola shares overnight. This influence is one of the most subtle and dangerous in the entire field of investment, and one against which even the most sophisticated investors must constantly be on guard. When for a long period of time a particular stock has been selling in a certain price range, say from a low of 38 to a high of 43, there is an almost irresistible tendency to attribute true value to this price level. Consequently, when, after the financial community has become thoroughly accustomed to this being the value of the stock, the appraisal changes and the stock, say, sinks to 24, all sorts of buyers who should know better rush in to buy. They jump to the conclusion that the stock must now be cheap. Yet if the fundamentals are bad enough, it may still be very high at 24. Conversely, as such a stock rises to, say, 50 or 60 or 70, the urge to sell and take a profit now that the stock is high becomes irresistible to many people. Giving in to this urge can be very costly. This is because the genuinely worthwhile profits in stock investing have come from holding the surprisingly large number of stocks that have gone up many times from their original cost. The only true test of whether a stock is cheap or high is not its current price in relation to some former price, no matter how accustomed we may have become to that former price, but whether the company's fundamentals are significantly more or less favorable than the current financial community appraisal of that stock. As previously mentioned, there is a third element of investment community appraisal that also must be considered, along with its appraisal of the industry and of the particular company. Only after all three are blended together can a worthwhile judgment be reached as to whether a stock is cheap or high at any given time. This third appraisal is that of the outlook for stocks in general. To see the rather extreme effects such general market appraisals can have in certain periods and how far these views can vary from the facts, it may be well to review the two most extreme such appraisals of the century. Ridiculous as it may seem to us today, in the period from 1927 to 1929, the majority of the financial community actually believed we were in a new era. For years, earnings of most U.S. companies had been growing with monotonous regularity. Not only had serious business depressions become a thing of the past, but a great engineer and businessman, Herbert Hoover, had been elected president. His competence was expected to assure even greater prosperity from then on. In such circumstances, it seemed to many that it had become virtually impossible to lose by owning stocks. And many who wanted to cash in as much as possible on this sure thing bought on margin to obtain more shares than they could otherwise afford. We all know what happened when reality shattered this particular appraisal. The agony of the Great Depression and the bear market of 1929 to 1932 will be long remembered. Contrary in outlook, but similar in being spectacularly wrong, was the investment community's appraisal of common stocks as an investment vehicle in the 3 years from mid-1946 to mid-1949. Most companies' earnings were extremely pleasing. However, pursuant to the then current appraisal, stocks were selling at the lowest price-earnings ratios in many years. The financial community was saying that these earnings don't mean anything, that they were just temporary and would shrink sharply or disappear in the depression that must come. The financial community remembered that the Civil War had been followed by the Panic of 1873, which marked the onset of a very severe depression that lasted until 1879. Following World War I had come the even worse crash of 1929 and another 6 years of major depression. Since World War II had involved a vastly greater effort and therefore a greater distortion of the economy than World War I, it was assumed that an even bigger bear market and an even worse depression were on the horizon. As long as this appraisal lasted, most stocks were so much on the bargain counter that when it began to dawn on the investment community that this image was false and that no severe depression lay in wait, the foundations had been laid for one of the longest periods of rising stock prices in U.S. history. Since the bear market of 1972 to 1974 brought with it the only other time in this century when most price-earnings ratios were about as low as they were in the 1946 to 1949 period, the question obviously arises as to the soundness of the financial community's appraisal that brought this about. Are the fears engendering these historically low price-earnings ratios valid? Could this be another 1946 Albanian Lex to 1949 Albanian Lex over again? An attempt will be made to throw some light on these matters in a later section of this book. There is a basic difference between the factors that affect changes in the general level of all stock prices and those that affect the relative price-earnings ratio of one stock compared to another within that general level. For reasons already discussed, the factors at any given moment that affect this relative price-earnings ratio of one stock to another are solely matters of the current image in the investment community of the particular company and the particular industry to which that company belongs. However, the level of stocks as a whole is not solely a matter of image but results partly from the financial community's current appraisal of the degree of attractiveness of common stocks and partly from a certain purely financial factor from the real world. This real-world factor is mainly involved with interest rates. When interest rates are high in either the long or short-term money markets, and even more so when they are high in both, there is a tendency for a larger part of the pool of investment capital to flow toward those markets, so the demand for stocks is less. Stocks may be sold to transfer funds to these markets. Conversely, when rates are low, funds flow out of those markets and into stocks. Therefore, higher interest rates tend to lower the level of all stocks and lower interest rates to raise that level. Similarly, when the public is in a mood to save a larger percentage of its income, more funds flow into the total capital pool and there is a more bullish pull on stock prices than when the pool of capital funds is rising more slowly. However, this is a much smaller influence than is the level of interest rates. An even smaller influence is the degree of fluctuation in new stock issues, which are a drain on the capital pool available to the stock market. The reason the new issue supply is not a bigger factor on the general level of stock prices is that when other influences cause stocks to be in favor, the new issue volume rises to take advantage of this situation. When common stock prices reach low levels, supply of new issues tends to diminish drastically. As a result, fluctuations in new issue volume are much more a result of other influences than an influencing factor themselves. This fourth dimension to stock investing might be summarized in this way: the price of any particular stock at any particular moment is determined by the current financial community appraisal of the particular company, of the industry it is in, and to some degree of the general level of stock prices. Determining whether at that moment the price of a stock is attractive, unattractive or somewhere in between depends for the most part on the degree these appraisals vary from reality. However, to the extent that the general level of stock prices affects the total picture, it also depends somewhat on correctly estimating coming changes in certain purely financial factors, of which interest rates are by far the most important. Part 3. Developing an Investment Philosophy. Dedication to Frank E. Block. This book was first published at the request of the Institute of Chartered Financial Analysts made under the C. Stuart Shepard Award. This award was conferred on Frank E. Block CFA. In recognition of his outstanding contribution through dedicated effort and inspiring leadership in advancing the Institute of Chartered Financial Analysts as a vital force in fostering the education of financial analysts, in establishing high ethical standards of conduct, and in developing programs and publications to encourage the continuing education of financial analysts. 1. Origins of a Philosophy. To understand any disciplined approach to investment, it is first necessary to understand the objective for which the methodology is designed. For any part of the funds supervised by Fisher & Company, except for funds temporarily in cash or cash equivalents awaiting more suitable opportunities, it is the objective that they be invested in a very small number of companies that, because of the characteristics of their management, should both grow in sales and more importantly in profits at a rate significantly greater than industry as a whole. They should also do so at relatively small risk in relation to the growth involved. To meet Fisher & Company standards, a management must have a viable policy for attaining these ends with all the willingness to subordinate immediate profits for the greater long-range gains that this concept requires. In addition, two characteristics are necessary. One is the ability to implement long-range policy with superior day-to-day performance in all the routine tasks of business operation. The other is that when significant mistakes occur, as is bound at times to happen when management strives for unique benefits through innovative concepts, new products, etc., or because management becomes too complacent through success, these mistakes are recognized clearly and remedial action is taken. Because I believe I best understand the characteristics of manufacturing companies, I have confined Fisher & Company activities largely to manufacturing enterprises that use a combination of leading-edge technology and superior business judgment to accomplish these goals. In recent years, I have confined Fisher & Company investments solely to this group, because on the few occasions when I have invested outside it, I have not been satisfied with the results. However, I see no reason why the same principles should not be equally profitable when applied by those with the necessary expertise in such fields as retailing, transportation, finance, etc. No investment philosophy, unless it is just a carbon copy of someone else's approach, develops in its complete form in any one day or year. In my own case, it grew over a considerable period of time, partly as a result of what perhaps may be called logical reasoning, and partly from observing the successes and failures of others, but much of it through the more painful method of learning from my own mistakes. Possibly the best way of trying to explain my investment approach to others is to use the historical route. For this reason I will go back into the early, formative years, attempting to show block by block how this investment philosophy developed. The birth of interest. My first awareness of the stock market and the opportunities which changing stock quotations might make possible occurred at a fairly early age. With my father the youngest of 5 and my mother the youngest of 8, at my birth I had only one surviving grandparent. This may have been one of the reasons why I felt particularly close to my grandmother. At any rate, I went to see her one afternoon when I was barely out of grammar school. An uncle dropped in to discuss with her his views of business conditions in the year ahead, and how this might affect the stock she owned. A whole new world opened up to me. By saving some money, I had the right to buy a share in the future profits of anyone I might choose among hundreds of the most important business enterprises of the country. If I chose correctly, these profits could be truly exciting. I thought the whole subject of judging what makes a business grow an intriguing one, and here was a game that if I learned to play it properly would by comparison make any other with which I was familiar seem drab, meaningless and unexciting. When my uncle left, my grandmother turned to me and said how sorry she was that he happened to come in when I was there, forcing her to spend time on matters which could not possibly interest me. I told her that, to the contrary, the hour he spent with her had seemed like 10 minutes, and that I had just heard something that interested me tremendously. Years later, I was to realize how very few were the shares she owned and how extremely superficial were the comments I heard that day, but the interest that was kindled by that conversation has continued all during my life. With this degree of interest and in a period when most businesses were far less concerned with the legal hazards of dealing with minors than is the case today, I was able to make a few dollars for myself during the roaring bull market of the middle 1920s. I was strongly discouraged from this, however, by my physician father, who felt that it would simply teach me gambling habits. This was unlikely, as I am not by nature inclined to take chances merely for the sake of taking chances, which is the nature of gambling. On the other hand, as I look back upon it, my tiny-scale stock activities of that period taught me almost nothing of any great value so far as investment policies were concerned. Formative experiences. Before the great bull market of the 1920s was to come to its crashing end, I did have an experience, however, that was to teach me much of real importance for use in the years ahead. In the 1927-28 academic year I was enrolled as a first-year student in Stanford University's then fledgling Graduate School of Business. 20% of that year's course, that is 1 day a week, was devoted to visiting some of the largest business enterprises in the San Francisco Bay Area. Professor Boris Emmett, who conducted this activity, had not been given this responsibility because of the usual academic background. In those days, the large mail-order companies obtained a significant part of their merchandise through contracts with suppliers whose sole customer was one or the other of these firms. These contracts frequently were so hard on the manufacturer and afforded him so little profit margin that from time to time a manufacturer would find himself in severe financial difficulty. It was not in the interest of the mail order houses to see their vendors fail. Professor Emmett had for some years been the expert employed by one such mail order firm with the job of salvaging these faltering companies when they had been squeezed too tightly. As a result, he knew a great deal about management. One of the rules under which this course was conducted was that we would visit no company that would just take us through the plant. After seeing the wheels go around, the management had to be willing to sit down with us so that, under the very shrewd questioning of our professor, we could learn something of what the strengths and weaknesses of the business really were. I recognized that this was a learning opportunity of just the type that I was seeking. I was able to jockey myself into a position to take particular advantage of it. In that day, over a half-century ago, when the ratio of automobiles to people was tremendously lower than it is today, Professor Emmett did not have a car. I did. I offered to drive him to these various plants. I did not learn much from him on the way over. However, each week on the way back to Stanford, I would hear comments of what he really thought of that particular company. This provided me with one of the most valuable learning experiences I have ever been privileged to enjoy. Also, on one of these trips I formed a specific conviction that was to prove of tremendous dollar value to me a few years in the future. It was actually to lay the foundation for my business. One week we visited not one but two manufacturing plants that were located next door to each other in San Jose. One was the John Bean Spray Pump Company, the world leaders in the manufacture of the type of pumps that were used to spray insecticides on orchards to combat natural pests. The other was the Anderson-Barngrover Manufacturing Company, also world leaders, but in the field of equipment used by fruit canneries. In the 1920s, the concept of a growth company had not yet been verbalized by the financial community. However, as I somewhat awkwardly worded it to Professor Emmett, I thought that those two companies had probabilities of growing very much beyond their present size to a degree that I had seen in no other company we had visited. He agreed with me. Also, through spending part of the time on these automobile trips by asking Professor Emmett about his previous business experiences, I learned something else that was to stand me in good stead in the years ahead. This was the extreme importance of selling in order to have a healthy business. A company might be an extremely efficient manufacturer or an inventor might have a product with breathtaking possibilities, but this was never enough for a healthy business. Unless that business contained people capable of convincing others as to the worth of their product, such a business would never really control its own destiny. It was later that I was to build on this base to conclude that even a strong sales arm is not enough. For a company to be a truly worthwhile investment, it must not only be able to sell its products, but also be able to appraise changing needs and desires of its customers. In other words, to master all that is implied in a true concept of marketing. First lessons in this school of experience. As the summer of 1928 approached and my first year in the business school came to an end, an opportunity arose which seemed to me too good to pass up. In contrast to the hundreds of students that are enrolled each year in this school today, my class, being only the third in the graduate school's history, contained 19 students. The graduating class 1 year ahead of me contained only 9. Just 2 of these 9 were trained in finance. In that day of great stock market ferment, both were snapped up by New York-based investment trusts. At the last minute, an independent San Francisco bank, which years later was acquired by the Crocker National Bank of that city, sent down to the school a request for a graduate trained in investments. The school was anxious not to pass up this opportunity because if their representative merited the approval of the bank, it could be the forerunner of many opportunities for placing future graduates in the years to come. However, they had no graduate to send. It was not easy to do, but when I heard of this opportunity, I finally persuaded the school to send me with the thought that if I were to make good, I would stay there. If I could not fill the job, I would come back and take second-year courses, with the bank realizing that the school had made no pretense of sending them a completely trained student. Security analysts in those pre-crash days were called statisticians. It was 3 successive years of sensationally falling stock prices that were to occur just a short time ahead that caused the work of Wall Street's statisticians to fall into such disrepute that the name was changed to security analysts. I found that I was to be the statistician for the investment banking end of the bank. In those days, there was no legal barrier to banks being in the brokerage or investment banking business. The work I was assigned to do was extremely simple. In my opinion, it was also intellectually dishonest. The investment arm of the bank was chiefly engaged in selling high-interest rate, new issues of bonds on which they made quite sizable commissions as part of underwriting syndicates. No attempt was made to evaluate the quality of these bonds or any stocks. They sold, but rather in that day of a seller's market they gratefully accepted any part of a syndicate offered them by their New York associates or by the large investment banking houses. Then the security salesman for the bank would portray to their customers that they had a statistical department capable of surveying those customers' holdings and issuing to them a report on each security handled. What was actually done in those security analyses was to look up the data on a particular company in one of the established manuals of the day, such as Moody's or Standard Statistics. Then someone like myself, with no further knowledge than what was reported in that manual, would simply paraphrase the wording of the manual to write his own report. Any company that was doing a large volume of sales was invariably reported as well managed, just because it was big. I was under no direct orders to recommend that customers switch some of the securities I analyzed into whatever security the bank was attempting to sell at the moment, but the whole atmosphere was one of encouraging this type of analysis. Building the basics. It was not very long before the superficiality of the whole procedure caused me to feel that there must be a better way to do this. I was extremely fortunate in having an immediate boss who completely understood why I was concerned and granted me the time to make an experiment which I proposed to him. At that time, in the fall of 1928, there was a great deal of speculative interest in radio stocks. I introduced myself as a representative of the investment arm of the bank to the buyers of the radio department of several retail establishments in San Francisco. I asked them their opinions of the 3 major competitors in this industry. I was given surprisingly similar opinions from each of them. In particular, I learned a great deal from one man who was himself an engineer and who had worked for one of these companies. One company, Philco, which from my standpoint unfortunately was privately owned so that it represented no stock market opportunity, had developed models which had a special market appeal. As a result, they were getting market share at a beautiful profit to themselves because they were highly efficient manufacturers. RCA was just about holding its own market share, whereas another company, which was a stock market favorite of the day, was slipping drastically and showing signs of getting into trouble. None of this was the direct business of the bank, for it was not handling radio stocks. Nevertheless, an evaluative report seemed likely to help me considerably within the bank because many key bank officers who would see it were personally involved in speculation in these issues. Nowhere in material from Wall Street firms who were talking about these hot radio issues could I find a single word about the troubles that were obviously developing for this speculative favorite. In the ensuing 12 months, as the stock market continued on its reckless but merry way with most stocks climbing to new highs, I noticed with increasing interest how the stock I had singled out for trouble was sagging further and further in that rising market. It was my first lesson in what later was to become part of my basic investment philosophy. Reading the printed financial records about a company is never enough to justify an investment. One of the major steps in prudent investment must be to find out about a company's affairs from those who have some direct familiarity with them. At this early point, however, I had not achieved the next logical step in this type of reasoning. It is also necessary to learn as much as possible about the people who are running a company under investment considerations, either by getting to know those people yourself or by finding someone in whom you have confidence who knows them well. American Samoa, 1929 started to unfold. I become more and more convinced of the unsoundness of the wild boom that seemed to be continuing. Stocks continued climbing to ever higher prices on the amazing theory that we were in a new era. Therefore, in the future, year after year of advancing per-share earnings could be taken as a matter of course. Yet as I tried to appraise the outlook for America's basic industries, I saw a number of them with supply-demand problems that seemed to me to indicate their outlook was getting rather wobbly. In August of 1929 I issued another special report to the officers of the bank. I predicted that the next 6 months would see the beginning of the greatest bear market in a quarter of a century. It would be very satisfying to my ego, if at this point, I could alter drastically the tale of just what happened and leave the impression that, having been exactly right in my forecasting, I then profited greatly from all this wisdom. The facts were quite to the contrary. Even though I felt strongly that the whole stock market was too high in those dangerous days of 1929, I was nevertheless entrapped by the lure of the market. This caused me to look around to find a few stocks that were still cheap and were worthwhile investments because they had not gone up yet. As a result of the small profits from the tiny amount of stock transactions a few years back and the saving of a good part of my salary, plus some money I had earned in college, I managed to scrape together several $1,000s as 1929 went along. I divided this almost equally among 3 stocks which, in my ignorance, I thought were still undervalued in that overpriced market. One was a leading locomotive company with a still quite low price-earnings ratio. With railroad equipment being one of the most cyclical of all industries, it takes very little imagination to see what was to happen to the company's sales and profits in the business depression that was about to engulf us. The other 2 were a local billboard company and a local taxicab company, also selling at very low price-earnings ratios. In spite of my success in ferreting out what was going to happen to the radio stocks, I just did not have the sense to start making similar inquiries from people who knew about these 2 local enterprises, even though obtaining such information or even getting to meet the people who ran these businesses would have been relatively simple, since they were close at hand. As the depression increased, I learned rather vividly why these companies had been selling at such low price-earnings ratios. By 1932, only a tiny percentage of my original investment was represented by the market value of the shares in these companies. The Great Bear Market. Fortunately for my future well-being, I have an intense dislike for losing money. I have always believed that the chief difference between a fool and a wise man is that the wise man learns from his mistakes, while the fool never does. The corollary of this is that it behooved me to go over my mistakes pretty carefully and not to repeat them again. My approach to investing expanded as I learned from my 1929 mistakes. I learned that, while a stock could be attractive when it had a low price-earnings ratio, a low price-earnings ratio by itself guaranteed nothing and was apt to be a warning indicator of a degree of weakness in the company. I began realizing that, all the then current Wall Street opinion to the contrary, what really counts in determining whether a stock is cheap or overpriced is not its ratio to the current year's earnings, but its ratio to the earnings a few years ahead. If I could build up in myself the ability to determine within fairly broad limits what those earnings might be a few years from now, I would have unlocked the key both to avoiding losses and to making magnificent profits. In addition to learning that a low price-earnings ratio was just as apt to be a sign that a stock was an investment trap as that it was a bargain, acute awareness of my miserable investment performances during the Great Bear Market made me vividly aware of something of possibly even greater importance. I had been spectacularly right in my timing of when the bull market bubble was about to burst, and almost right in judging the full force of what was to happen. Yet except for a possible small boost in my reputation among a very small circle of people, this had done me no good whatsoever. From then on, I was to realize that all the correct reasoning about an investment policy or about the desirability or purchase or sale of any particular stock did not have the least bit of value until it was translated into action through the completion of specific transactions. A chance to do my thing. In the spring of 1930 I made a change of employers. I only mention this because it triggered the events that were to cause the emergence of the investment philosophy that has guided me since that time. A regional brokerage firm came to me and made me a salary offer which, at age 22 and for that time and place, I found quite difficult to refuse. Furthermore, they offered me a vastly more appealing work assignment than the dissatisfying experience as a statistician in the investment banking arm of the bank. With no aside duties whatsoever, I was to be free to devote my time to finding individual stocks which I thought were particularly suitable candidates for either purchase or sale because of their characteristics. I was then to write reports on my conclusions to circulate among the brokers employed by this firm to help them stimulate business that would be profitable for their clients. This offer came to me just after Herbert Hoover had made his famous "prosperity is just around the corner" statement. Several partners of the firm involved implicitly believed this. As a result of the 1929 crash, their total payroll had dropped from 125 employees to 75. They told me that if I accepted their offer, I would be number 76. I was just as bearish at the time as they were bullish. I felt sure the bear market was a long way from over. I told them that I would come on one condition. While they were free to fire me at any time if they did not like the quality of my work, lack of seniority must be no influence whatsoever if adverse financial markets forced them to make further reduction in payroll. They agreed to this provision. From disaster, opportunity springs. As employers, I could not have asked for nicer people. In the ensuing 8 months, I had one of the most valuable business educational experiences of my life. I saw at first-hand example after example of how the investment business should not be conducted. American Samoa, 1930 unfolded and stocks once again continued on what seemed like an almost endless decline. My employer's position got more and more precarious. Then, just before Christmas of 1930, we, who had so far survived the economic holocaust, witnessed the grim picture of the whole firm being suspended from the San Francisco Stock Exchange for insolvency. This grim news for my associates was to prove one of the most fortunate business developments, if not the most fortunate, of my life. For some time I had vague plans that when prosperity returned I would start my own business by charging clients a fee for managing their investments. I am purposely using this roundabout way to describe the activities of an investment counselor or an investment advisor because in those days neither of these terms had yet been used. However, with almost everyone in the financial business retrenching during that gloomy January of 1931, the only security industry job I could find was a purely clerical and, to me, quite an attractive one. If I had properly analyzed the situation, I would have realized that this was exactly the right time to start a new business of the kind I had in mind. I was to find that there were two reasons for this. One was that, after almost 2 years of the most severe bear market this nation had ever seen, nearly everyone was so dissatisfied with their existing brokerage connections that they were in the mood to listen even to someone both young and advocating a radically different approach to the handling of their investments, as was I. Also, as the economy reached its depths in 1932, many key businessmen had so little to do in pursuing their own affairs that they had the time to see someone who was calling on them. In more normal times, I would never have gotten by their secretaries. One of the most worthwhile clients of my entire business career, and the man whose family's investments I still handle, was a typical example of this. Some years afterwards he told me that on the day I called he had had almost nothing to do and had already finished reading the sports section of the newspaper. So when my name and purpose were told him by his secretary, he thought, listening to this guy will at least occupy my time. He confessed, if you had come to see me a year or so later, you never would have gotten into my office. A foundation is formed. All this was to result in several years of very hard work in a tiny office with low overhead. With no windows and merely glass partitions to serve as two of the walls, my total floor space was little larger than that needed to jam together a desk, my chair, and one other chair. For this, together with free local telephone service and a reasonable amount of secretarial help from the secretary receptionist of the gentleman from whom I leased this space, I paid the princely sum of $25 per month. My only other expenses were stationery, postage and a very occasional long-distance call. The account book still in my possession provides an indication of how difficult it really was to start a new business in 1932. After very long hours of work over and above this overhead, I made a net profit averaging $2.99 per month for that year. In the still difficult year of 1933, I did a trifle better, showing an improvement of just under 1,000%, an average monthly earnings of just over $29. This possibly was about what I would have made as a newsboy selling papers on the street. Yet in what those years were to bring me in the future, they were two of the most profitable years of my life. They provided me with the foundation for an extremely profitable business and with a group of highly loyal clients by 1935. It would be nice if I could claim that it was brilliant thinking on my part that caused me to start my business when I did rather than waiting until better times were to arrive. Actually, it was the unattractiveness of the only job that seemed open to me that pushed me into it. 2. Learning from experience. While I had been working at the bank, I had noticed with considerable interest a news item about the two neighboring San Jose companies that had intrigued me so much during my student days at the Stanford Business School. In 1928, the John Bean Manufacturing Company and the Anderson Barn Grover Manufacturing Company had merged with the leading vegetable canning manufacturer, Sprague Cells Corporation of Hoopeston, Illinois, to form a brand new entity called the Food Machinery Corporation. As in other periods of rampant speculation, the nation was in the throes of such a stock-buying mania that the supply of Food Machinery Corporation stock offered for sale rose in price in an attempt to meet the demand. In that same year of 1928, at least 20 other new issues, and perhaps twice that many, were sold by members of the San Francisco Stock Exchange to eager buyers in the Bay Area. The lack of soundness of some of these issues was little short of appalling. An officer of one stock exchange firm, that sold shares in a company that was to sell bottled water from across the Pacific, told me that these shares were sold without a complete set of financial statements in the hands of the underwriters, who had little more than a photograph of the spring from which the water was supposed to come and a minor amount of personal contact with the selling shareholders. In the public mind, the stock of the Food Machinery Corporation was just another of the exciting new offerings of that year, neither significantly better nor worse than the rest. It was offered at a price of $21 1/2. In those days, pools for the manipulation of shares were entirely legal. A local group with little expertise in running a pool but headed by a man with great enthusiasm for Food Machinery Corporation decided to run an operation in the company's shares. The methods of all these pools were fundamentally similar. The members would sell stock back and forth among themselves at gradually rising prices. All this activity on the stock tape would attract the attention of others, who would then start to buy and take the pool's shares off its hands at still higher prices. Some highly skilled manipulators, some of whom had made many millions of dollars and one of whom, a year or so later, was to offer me a junior partnership, were quite experienced and able practitioners of this rather questionable art. Manipulation was not the objective of the operators of this food machinery pool, however. As the autumn of 1929 was to arrive and stocks were to face the precipice that lay ahead, the pool managed to buy for itself most of the shares that had been offered to the public. Although the quoted price of the food machinery shares at the peak was in the high 50s, there was very little stock in the hands of the public as a result. As in each of the succeeding years the general level of business activities worsened relative to the year before, it was obvious what was to happen to the flotsam and jetsam of small companies that went public in the 1928 excitement. One after another of these companies passed into bankruptcy, with many of the remainder reporting losses rather than profits. The market for the shares of these firms largely dried up. There were one or two companies in this group other than food machinery that were fundamentally both sound and attractive. However, the general public showed no discrimination whatsoever, considering all of them little more than speculative junk. By the time the market was to reach its final low in 1932, and again equal that low at the time of closing of the entire banking system of the country coincidental with the inauguration of Franklin D. Roosevelt on March 4, 1933, food machinery shares were down to a price of between $4 and $5, with the all-time low being 100 shares at $3.75. Food Machinery as an Investment Opportunity. American Samoa, 1931 unfolded, and I cast about seeking an opportunity for my infant business. I looked upon Food Machinery's situation with increasing excitement. Recognizing the costliness of my not having taken the trouble to meet with and judge the management of the two local companies in which I had lost such a large percentage of my investment a few years before, I determined never to make this mistake again. The more I got to know the food machinery people, the greater my respect for them grew. Because in many ways this company, as it existed in the depths of the Great Depression, was a microcosm of the type of opportunity I was to seek in the years ahead. It may be helpful to explain just what it was that caused me nearly a half-century ago to see such a future in this particular corporation. Parenthetically, and unfortunately, I did not carry my policy of in-depth field analysis through to its logical conclusion in the immediate years. I was less diligent in getting to know and to judge managements that were located in more distant areas. In the first place, even though food machinery was relatively small, it was a world leader in size and, I believe, in quality of the product line in each of the three activities in which it was engaged. This gave the firm the advantage of scale. That is, as a large and efficient manufacturer, the firm could also be a low-cost producer. Next, its marketing position was, from a competitive standpoint, extremely strong. Its products were highly regarded by its customers. It controlled its own sales organization. Furthermore, its canning machinery lines, with a large number of installations already in the field, had a locked-up market of some proportions. This consisted of spare and replacement parts for the equipment already in the field. Added to this sound base was the most exciting part of the business. For a company of its size, the firm enjoyed a superbly creative engineering or research department. The company was perfecting equipment in promising new product areas. Among these were the first mechanical pear peeler ever to be offered to the industry, the first mechanical peach pitter, and a process for synthetically coloring oranges. Oranges from areas which produced fruit with the most juice was at a competitive disadvantage because the product looked less attractive to the housewife than other types in which intrinsic quality was no better. At only one other time in my business life have I seen a company which, in my judgment, had on the horizon as big a dollar volume of potentially successful new products in relation to the then existing size of business as was the case with the Food Machinery Corporation in the period from 1932 through 1934. By this time, I had learned enough to know that, no matter how attractive, such matters by themselves were not sufficient to assure great success. The quality of the people involved in the company was just as critical. I use the word quality to encompass two quite different characteristics. One of these is business ability. Business ability can be further broken down into two very different types of skills. One of these is handling the day-to-day tasks of business with above-average efficiency. In the day-to-day tasks, I include 101 matters, varying all the way from constantly seeking and finding better ways to produce more efficiently to watching receivables with sufficient closeness. In other words, operating skill implies above-average handling of the many things that have to do with the near-term operation of the business. However, in the business world, top-notch managerial ability also calls for another skill that is quite different. This is the ability to look ahead and make long-range plans that will produce significant future growth for the business without at the same time running financial risks that may invite disaster. Many companies contain managements that are very good at one or the other of these skills. However, for real success, both are necessary. Business ability is only one of the two people traits that I believe is absolutely essential for a truly worthwhile investment. The other falls under the general term of integrity and encompasses both the honesty and the personal decency of those who are running a company. Anyone receiving his first indoctrination into the investment world in the period that preceded the 1929 crash would have seen rather vivid examples of the extreme importance of integrity. The owners and managers of a business are always closer to that business's affairs than are the stockholders. If the managers do not have a genuine sense of trusteeship for the stockholders, sooner or later the stockholders may fail to receive a significant part of what is justly due them. Managers preoccupied by their own personal interests are not likely to develop an enthusiastic team of loyal people around them, something that is an absolute must if a business is to grow to a size that one or two people can no longer control. As I saw the situation in those dark days of the Deep Depression, and as I see it now after all these years, this infant food machinery corporation was unusually attractive from the people's standpoint. John D. Crummy, the president and son-in-law of the original founder of the John Bean Manufacturing Company, was not only an extremely efficient operating head and highly regarded by his customers and his employees, but also he was a deeply religious man who scrupulously lived up to a high moral code. The chief engineer of the company was a brilliant conceptual designer. Also of considerable importance, he was a man who designed along lines that would give his products worthwhile patent protection. Finally, to round out the strength of this relatively small organization, John Crummy persuaded his son-in-law, Paul L. Davies, who was reluctant to abandon what appeared to be a most promising career in banking, to join the company to give it financial strength and conservatism. Actually, Paul Davies at first made this move so reluctantly that he only agreed to take a one-year leave of absence from the bank to help his family business over the first rough year of merger. During that year, he became so interested in the exciting prospects that lay ahead that he decided to stay permanently with the company. Later, as its president, he was to lead it to a size and degree of prosperity that was to dwarf the pleasing accomplishments of the next few years. This then was a company that inherently had desirable characteristics that are only occasionally found among available investments. The people were outstanding. Yet, small as the company was, it was not just one man who was making key contributions. In relation to competitors, the company was unusually strong. It was handling its business well, and it had in the offing enough new product lines with potentials that were large in relation to the then size of the company. Even if some of these products did not materialize, the future should be very bright with others. Zigging and zacking. However, to all this should be added something of equal importance if an investment is to prove a genuine bonanza. The largest profits in the investment field go to those who are capable of correctly zigging when the financial community is zacking. If the future of the Food Machinery Corporation had been properly appraised at that time, the profits that were to accrue to those who bought the shares in the 1932 to 1934 period would have been very much smaller. It was only because the true worth of this company was not generally recognized and Food Machinery was thought to be just another of the many flaky companies which were sold to the public at the height of a speculative orgy that it was possible to buy these shares in quantity at the ridiculous price to which they had sunk. This matter of training oneself not to go with the crowd but to be able to zig when the crowd zags, in my opinion, is one of the most important fundamentals of investment success. I wish I had the command of English to be able to describe adequately the degree of my internal, emotional and intellectual excitement as I contemplated what this as yet financially unrecognized Food Machinery Corporation might do for both my tiny personal finances and for the infant business I was attempting to get started. My timing seemed right. Like a spring that had been compressed too far and was starting to recoil. The years from 1933 to 1937 were to see stocks as a whole advancing slowly at first, and then bursting into a full-bloom bull market, followed by a sizable break in 1938 and a full recovery the following year. With deep conviction that Food Machinery would vastly outperform the market as a whole, I bought my clients every share that I was able to convince them to hold. I made the possibilities of this business the spearhead of my approach in talking to any potential clients I could reach. I felt that here was just the type of unique, almost once-in-a-lifetime, opportunity that Shakespeare so well described when he said, "There is a tide in the affairs of men which, taken at the flood, leads on to fortune. In those exciting years when my hopes were high and both my purse and reputation in the financial community were almost non-existent, I quoted those exciting words to myself time and time again to stiffen my determination. Contrary, but correct. Much has been written in the literature of investments on the importance of contrary opinion. Contrary opinion, however, is not enough. I have seen investment people so imbued with the need to go contrary to the general trend of thought that they completely overlook the corollary of all this, which is, when you do go contrary to the general trend of investment thinking, you must be very, very sure that you are right. For example, as it became obvious that the automobile was largely to displace the streetcar and the shares of the once favored urban railways began to sell at ever lower price-earnings ratios, it would have been a rather costly thing just to be contrary and buy streetcar securities only on the grounds that because everyone thought they were in a declining stage, they must be attractive. Huge profits are frequently available to those who zig when most of the financial community is zagging, providing they have strong indications that they are right in their zigging. If a quotation from Shakespeare was a vital force in formulating my policies on the matter, so also, strangely enough, was a popular song from World War I. As one of the very thinning ranks of those who can still remember how the home front reacted in the stirring days of 1918, I might point out that in its excitement and enthusiasm for that war the American public had a naivete then quite different from its grimness about such matters in World War II, when the horrors of war were more clearly understood. First-hand news of the casualties and the filth and the terror of those in the front lines had not yet permeated the continental United States in 1918. As a result, the popular music of the day was filled with cheerful and humorous war songs in a way that happened on a much smaller scale in World War II, and not at all during the Vietnam fiasco. Most of these songs came out in the form of sheet music for pianos. One of these songs, published with a picture of a proud mama looking down on parading soldiers, had the title, "They're All Out of Step But Jim." I recognized from the very first that I was running a distinct risk of being out of step. My very early purchases of food machinery and a number of other companies were bought out of phase, when their intrinsic merit was completely unrecognized by the financial community. I might be completely wrong in my thinking and the financial community could be right. If so, nothing would be worse for my clients or myself than letting my firm convictions about a particular situation lock up a sizable amount of funds unprofitably for an endless period of years because I zigged when the financial community had zagged, and I had been wrong in doing so. However, while I realize thoroughly that if I were to make the kinds of profits that are made possible by the process that I have described as zigging when the rest zags, it was vital that I have some sort of quantitative check to be sure that I was right in zigging. Patience and performance. With this in mind, I established what I called my 3-year rule. I have repeated again and again to my clients that when I purchase something for them, not to judge the results in a matter of a month or a year, but to allow me a 3-year period. If I have not produced worthwhile results for them in that time, they should fire me. Whether I have been successful in the first year or unsuccessful can be as much a matter of luck as anything else. In my management of individual stocks over all these years I have followed the same rule, only once having made an exception. If I have a deep conviction about a stock that is not performed by the end of 3 years, I will sell it. If the same stock has performed worse rather than better than the market for a year or two, I won't like it. However, assuming that nothing has happened to change my original view of the company, I will continue to hold it for 3 years. In the second half of 1955, I bought a substantial number of shares in two companies in which I had never previously invested. They proved to be almost a classic example of the advantages and problems of investing contrary to the currently accepted view of the financial community. Looking back, 1955 could be considered the beginning of a period of almost 15 years that might be termed the first golden age of electronic stocks. I am using the adjective first so that there can be no confusion in anyone's mind with what I believe will be considered the golden age for semiconductor stocks, something which I suspect lies ahead of us and will be associated with the 1980s. At any rate, in 1955 and immediately thereafter, the financial community was about to be dazzled by a whole series of electronic companies which were to show gains that by 1969 had reached truly spectacular proportions. IBM, Texas Instruments, Varian, Litton Industries and Ampex are a few that come to mind. However, in 1955, all of that lay ahead. At that time, with the exception of IBM, all these stocks were considered highly speculative and beneath the notice of conservative investors or big institutions. However, sensing part of what might lie ahead, I acquired what for me were rather sizable positions in both Texas Instruments and Motorola during the latter parts of 1955. Today Texas Instruments is the largest worldwide producer of semiconductors, with Motorola running a close second. At that time, Motorola's position in the semiconductor industry was insignificant. It was no factor at all in causing me to buy the shares. Rather, I became impressed both with the people and with Motorola's dominant position in the mobile communications business, where an enormous potential seemed to lie. Whereas the financial community was valuing it as just another television and radio producer. Motorola's subsequent rise in the semiconductor area, resulting at least in part from their acquiring the services of Dr. Daniel Noble, was all to come later and was additional icing on the cake not anticipated by me at the time of purchase. In the case of Texas Instruments, aside from an equally great liking and respect for the people, I was influenced by a quite different set of beliefs. I saw, as did others, a tremendous future that could be built out of their transistor business as the complexities of semiconductors were yielding to human ingenuity. I felt that those were people who could compete on at least even terms, and probably better than even terms, with General Electric, RCA, Westinghouse, and other giant companies despite the opinion of much of Wall Street. A number of people criticized me for risking funds in a small speculative company which they felt was bound to suffer from the competition of the corporate giants. After buying these shares, the near-term results in the stock market were quite different. Within a year, Texas Instruments had increased in value quite handsomely. Motorola fluctuated in a range from 5% to 10% below my cost of purchase. It performed sufficiently poorly that one of my major clients became so irritated by its market action that he refused to call Motorola by name. He only referred to it as "that turkey which you bought me." These unsatisfactory quotations were to continue for moderately over a year. Yet as awareness of the investment significance of the communications arm of Motorola was to seep into the consciousness of the financial community, together with the first signs of a turnabout in the semiconductor area, the stock then became a rather spectacular performer. While I was buying Motorola, I was doing so in conjunction with a large insurance company that had let the Motorola management know that they were also interested in the conclusions of my first visit. Shortly after, the insurance company too had bought a significant amount of Motorola stock. They submitted their entire portfolio to a New York bank for appraisal. With the exception of Motorola, the bank divided their portfolio into three groups: most attractive, less attractive, and least attractive. They refused to place Motorola in any category, however, saying this was not the type of company on which they spent time. Therefore they had no opinion about it. Yet one of the officials of the insurance company told me over 3 years later that in the face of this rather negative Wall Street view, Motorola had by that time outperformed every other stock in their portfolio. If I had not had my 3-year rule, I might have been less firm in holding my own Motorola intact through a period of poor market action and of some client criticism. To every rule, there are exceptions, but not many. Have I ever sold stock because of this 3-year rule and then later wished I had not made this sale because of a subsequent major rise in the stock? Actually, there have only been a relatively small number of times when I have made a sale triggered by this 3-year rule and nothing else. This is not because there have been so few times that purchases made by me have failed to provide the major rise which was my purpose in initiating them. In the majority of such cases, further insights about the company opened up as I continued to investigate additional aspects of the situation, and these insights caused me to change my views about it. However, in those relatively few cases where it was the 3-year rule and only that which caused me to sell, I cannot recall a single case where subsequent market action caused me to wish I had held on to the shares. Have I ever violated my own 3-year rule? The answer is yes, exactly once, and this was many years later, toward the middle of the 1970s. 3 years before, I had acquired a moderately substantial block of shares in the Rogers Corporation. Rogers had expertise in certain areas of polymer chemistry, and I believed they were on the way to developing very semi-proprietary families of products which would show quite dramatic increase in sales, and not just for a year or two, but for many years. Yet, at the end of 3 years the stock was down, and so were the earnings of the company. Several influences were at work, however, which made me feel this was one time to ignore my own standards and to make this the exception that proves the rule. One of these influences was my strong feeling about Norman Greenman, the company's president. I was convinced he had unusual ability, the determination to see these matters through, as well as something else which I consider of great value to an intelligent investor, the kind of honesty that caused him not to conceal repeated bad news that could not fail but be embarrassing for him to tell. He saw to it that those interested in his company understood all the unfavorable aspects of what was happening, as well as the favorable potentials. There was another element which influenced me greatly. A major reason the company's profits were so poor was that Rogers was spending a quite disproportionate amount of money on a single new product development seeming to offer prospects of great results. This was diverting both money and people from other potentially exciting new products which were getting less corporate effort. New products of this type do have magnificent potential. When the painful decision was made to abandon all the effort on this one particular product, it was not long before it became quite apparent that several other innovations of great promise were starting to flower. All this, however, took time. In the meanwhile, the company's failure to live up to the hopes of many of those who had bought the shares caused the stock to drop to levels that were absurd in relation to its sales, its assets, or any type of normal earning power. Here seemed a classic example of saying when the financial community was sacking. Therefore, 3-year rule or no, I sizably further increased my holdings and those of my clients, even though a few of those clients, influenced by the years of waiting and the negative performance, looked at this with a degree of apprehension. As so often happens in situations of this sort, when the turn came, it came fast. As it became apparent that the betterment of earnings was not a 1 or 2 year matter, but gave strong indications of being but the basis for years of genuine growth, the stock continued to rise proportionately. An experiment with market timing. All this, however, gets me years ahead of my story, because back in the 1930s there were other things I also had to learn through trial and error as my investment philosophy was gradually taking shape. In my casting around for ways to make money through common stocks, I began realizing that I might have a worthwhile byproduct from my study of the Food Machinery Corporation. Enough of their business was dependent on the fruit and vegetable canning industry so that in order to be reasonably sure I was right about my food machinery purchases, I had inadvertently learned a good deal about what influenced the fortunes of the fruit and vegetable canning companies themselves. This industry was highly cyclical because of both fluctuating general business conditions and erratic weather influences as they affected specific crops. As long as I was becoming somewhat familiar with the characteristics of the packing industry anyway, I decided I might as well try and take advantage of this knowledge, not through long-term investments, as I was doing with food machinery, but through in-and-out transactions in the shares of the California Packing Corporation, then an independent company and the largest fruit and vegetable canner. 3 different times, from the depths of the Big Depression to the end of that decade, I bought shares of this company. Each time, I sold them at a profit. Superficially, this might sound like I was doing something quite worthwhile. Nevertheless, when, for reasons I will explain shortly, I endeavored a few years later to analyze the wise and unwise moves I made in my business, it became increasingly apparent to me how silly these activities were. They took a great deal of time and effort that could well have been devoted to other things. Yet the total rewards in dollars in relation to the sums at risk were insignificant in comparison to the profits I had made for my people in food machinery and in other situations where I had bought for long-range gains and held over a considerable period of years. Furthermore, I had seen enough of in-and-out trading, including some done by extremely brilliant people, that I knew that being successful 3 times in a row only made it that much more likely that the 4th time I would end in disaster. The risks were considerably more than those involved in purchasing equal amounts of shares in companies I considered promising enough to want to hold them for many years of growth. Therefore, at the end of World War II, by which time much of my present investment philosophy was largely formulated, I had made what I believe was one of the more valuable decisions of my business life. This was to confine all efforts solely to making major gains over the long run. Reaching for price, foregoing opportunity. During the 1930s I learned, or at least partially learned, something else which I consider truly important. I have already mentioned my complete failure to benefit from my correct forecasts of the Great Bear Market which started in 1929. All the correct reasoning in the world is of no benefit in stock investment unless it is turned into specific action. My first experience in operating my own business occurred during the depth of the Great Depression, when very small amounts of money became of abnormal significance. Possibly because of this, or possibly because of my personal characteristics, as I started my business I found myself constantly battling for eighths and quarters. Brokers who knew much more than I did kept telling me if I believed that a stock would rise in a few years to several times its current price, it really made very little difference whether I acquired its shares at $10 or $10 one quarter, yet I continually placed limit orders with no better reason for a limit than a purely arbitrary decision on my part that I would pay, say, $101 and $8 and no more. Logically, this is ridiculous. I have observed it to be a bad investment habit that is deeply ingrained in many people besides myself, but not ingrained at all in others. The potential dangers of arbitrary limits were made clear to me as a result of a mistake of someone else. I remember as though it were yesterday running into one of my more important clients by chance on the sidewalk in front of a San Francisco bank. I told him that I had just come back from visiting the Food Machinery Corporation. The outlook was never so exciting, and that I thought he should buy some additional shares. He completely agreed with me and asked where the stocks had closed that particular afternoon. I told him $34 one half. He gave me a significant order and said he would pay $33 three quarters but no more. Over the next day or two the stock fluctuated in a range just fractionally above his bid. It never got down to it. I phoned him twice, urging him to go up a quarter of a point so that I could buy stock. Unfortunately he replied, "No, that is my price." Within a few weeks the stock had risen over 50% and, after allowing for stock split-ups, never again in the company's history was it to come down to anywhere near where he could have bought it. This gentleman's actions made an impression on me that my own stupidity had not. Gradually, I was to overcome much of this weakness of mine. I am thoroughly aware that if a buyer desires to acquire a very large block of stock, he cannot completely ignore this matter of an eighth or a quarter, because by buying a very few shares he can significantly put the price up on himself for the balance. However, for the great majority of transactions, being stubborn about a tiny fractional difference in the price can prove extremely costly. In my own case, I have completely conquered it in regard to buying, but only partially in regard to selling. Within the past year, my placing a small sell order with a limit rather than at the market caused me to miss a transaction by exactly a quarter of a point, with the result that, as I write this, the shares are now down 35% from where I placed my order. At levels only halfway between that limit order and current prices, I sold only part of this not very large holding. 3. The philosophy matures. Our entry into World War II was not entirely without some significance in the development of my investment philosophy. Early in 1942 I found myself in an unaccustomed role as a ground officer doing various business-related jobs for the Army Air Corps. For 3.5 years, I simply beached my business as I performed my not very valuable services on behalf of Uncle Sam. In recent years, I have frequently said that I did quite a job for my country. Neither Hitler nor Emperor Hirohito ever succeeded in getting a man into the territories I defended. These were Arkansas, Texas, Kansas, and Nebraska. At any rate, during this time of various desk-type jobs wearing Uncle Sam's uniform, I found that almost without warning I would alternate between two different types of periods. For a while, I would have so much to do that the last thing I would be able to think about was my peacetime business. At other times, I would sit at my desk with very little to do. When things were slow, I found it less unpleasant to analyze in great detail just how I would build up my business when the happy day that I would no longer be wearing a uniform might arise, and it was to think of the personal living and army-type problems with which, from a short-range point of view, I was confronted. It was during such periods that my present investment philosophy took steadily more definite shape. It was then I decided there was not enough future in the type of in-and-out trading that I have described in the stock of California packing. During this period, I reached two other conclusions that were to be of some significance to my future business. Before the war I had served all types of clients, large and small, with varying types of objectives. Most, but not all, of my business had been focused on finding unusual companies that would enjoy significant, above-average growth in future years. After the war, I would limit my clientele to a small group of large investors with the objective of concentrating solely on this single class of growth investment. For tax reasons, growth was more likely to benefit these clients. My other major conclusion was that the chemical industry would enjoy a period of major growth in the post-war years. Therefore, a high-priority project on returning to civilian life was to endeavor to find the most attractive of the larger chemical companies and make this a major holding for the funds I was handling. I by no means spent 100% of my time doing this, but in the first year after restarting my business I did spend a rather considerable amount of time in talking to anyone I could find who had real knowledge of this complex industry. Such people as distributors who handled the lines of one or more large companies, professors in the chemical departments of the universities who had intimate knowledge of chemical business people, and even some of those in the major construction companies that had put up plants for various of the chemical producers all proved extremely worthwhile sources of background information. By combining these inputs with analyses of the usual financial data, it only took about 3 months to narrow the choices down to one of 3 companies. From there on, the going was slower and the decisions more difficult. However, by the spring of 1947 I decided that the Dow Chemical Company would be my choice. E pluribus unum. There were many reasons for the choice of Dow Chemical from the many promising chemical firms. I believe it might be worthwhile to enumerate some of them because they are clear examples of the type of things I seek in the relatively small number of companies in which I desire to place funds. As I began to know various people in the Dow organization, I found that the growth that had already occurred was in turn creating a very real sense of excitement at many levels of management. The belief that even greater growth lay ahead permeated the organization. One of my favorite questions in talking to any top business executive for the first time is what he considers to be the most important long-range problem facing his company. When I asked this of the president of Dow, I was tremendously impressed with his answer. It is to resist the strong pressures to become a more military-like organization as we grow very much larger, and to